Hey guys, this is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the philosophy, poetry, literature, humanities, whatever app. Today, I'm joined by Lindsay O'Connor, and she's going to teach us a short story by Herman Melville. I won't say anything more. I'll just let her do her thing.
Great. Hello. I'm excited to move into teaching prose, which is my original love. So we're doing Herman Melville's Bartleby, the Scrivener, which was published in 1853. What to say? I guess I will just start talking about the text. I don't have a whole lot to offer on Melville himself. I guess I could say this comes out after Moby Dick. I think that's correct. Luke knows the history a little bit better than I do. And the full name is Bartleby the Scrivener, A Story of Wall Street. So to set the scene, I guess maybe a little bit, we are at a law office on Wall Street in New York City, with a very interesting narrator who is a lawyer in this office who employs Bartleby the Scrivener. So I guess I want to start by talking about this narrator and what his deal is, if we could maybe just like characterize him a little bit. So what was your sense of the narrator?
Well, all right. So I identified a lot with the narrator.
Okay.
And by the way, if anyone's interested in this, like you can listen to this as a free audiobook on LibriVox. It's a wonderful resource. I highly recommend it to everyone, as well as reading it. So the narrator, I found him, and I'm sure you will counter me on this, but I found him to be a very kind and rational and reasonable man. Mm-hmm. So in the course of this story, I don't know how much, when we're doing these sort of discussions, how much to give away in terms of the summation. May I say something about the plot, or should we hold off on that?
What do you mean? I mean, we're assuming people have read it, so we're not spoiling anything, right?
Maybe not. This might be their first sampling of Bartleby the Scrivener.
Oh, I didn't understand that. I was coming into this as I was teaching, and my students have usually read the text, right?
Well, let's
proceed as if they've read the text, right?
Let's sum it up a little bit. All right. Let me see if I can do my best. In the sense that, okay, so you've got this narrator. We don't know his name, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, and he runs an office, and he's got like three stooges underneath him. Mm-hmm. What are their names? Turkey, Ginger Nut, and
Nippers.
And Nippers, right? Mm-hmm. And so their whole job is to copy whatever sort of legal documents that come in there. And somehow Bartleby, this fellow named Bartleby, comes into his employment, and he is there to copy as well. And then it's shortly thereafter that Bartleby starts resisting the most mundane requests from this narrator, whether it's to fetch the mail or copy or edit something or whatever. He just says, I'd prefer not to. And then ultimately what ends up happening is that this person just goes out of their way to accommodate Bartleby. Eventually he has to turn him out, gives him like 7 days notice. He still won't leave. He changes his offices. The new people that come into the office like assign the responsibility to him, and ultimately Bartleby ends up in prison. He stages a hunger strike, and Bartleby eventually dies, right? But the whole motif throughout the entire thing is the simplest thing Bartleby will not ascend to, and he always says, I'd prefer not to. Okay. So my sense of the narrator is that he was a very kind and reasonable man, and he went way out of his way to make sure that Bartleby was cared for.
Sure. So tell me about him as a narrator. You told me about him as a character, or how you perceive him as a character, but I'm interested in him as a narrator, right? Like, we get the story through him, and that's super important. So, like, why is he telling the story? How about that? Like, how does he present his reasons for even sharing this thing with us?
I mean, I get the sense that there might be something confessional to it, right? Like, he has to, like, soothe his conscience, and the fact that he feels like he did everything to take care of this person, that be he a vagrant or a mentally insane person or something like that. So there might be something like he's in the confession booth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that a proper way to speak about it? Yeah.
There's no right answers here, right? So, like, I mean, a reason why I really want to teach this or talk about this story is I think it's a story that can teach us a lot about interpretation. Like, I think it's a story that has so many possible meanings. No one has decided, like, what its secret is or anything like that now. Like, there are still many possible readings that coexist and aren't necessarily at odds with each other. There's all these different possible layers or different ways of, like, highlighting one thing and like diminishing another thing or whatever. So like, I don't think there's like a proper. I mean, there's things that are like totally out of left field, right? That might be like wrong, but like. That's fine.
It seems to me that there's latitude, like many works of this type of prose or fiction or whatever. Like there's latitude in interpretation, but not infinite interpretations, right? But the interpretations that are permissible might be diametrically opposed to one another. Maybe.
Maybe. I guess I don't. Yeah, I mean, I think that like we were talking a little bit earlier about some of the like Marxist readings, like and how you were seeing like some kind of polarization there. So the idea that it's confessional seems great to me, right? Because I think like he's going through great pains throughout the story to like remind us and to sort of like editorialize about his own reactions, right?
Yeah.
Like he's talking about like the one time he lost his temper and he feels very bad about that, right? That like this thing happened and then he reconsidered and like he brings the other guys in, right? A few times I think when like to get like some backup, when Bartleby's
he's like,
kind of crazy, he's like, am I nuts or is it him?
Yeah.
So there's all those kinds of things that he tells us, and so like I'm with you. I see that what you're saying about like needing to kind of get all this out there and be like somehow I was the person who was closest to him, because that's a big part of this too. I think that maybe is worth mentioning now, like that our narrator employs Bartleby. His business is expanding. He comes into more business, and he needs to hire this third copyist. And so Bartleby like appears, I guess, after some ad in a newspaper or something like that. And he finds him to be a good balance to the other people in the office, and so he hires him. And then after when all these things happen, and the narrator finally decides he's going to like vacate those that office and move to a different one in a different building, the lawyer who takes over that office comes and finds our narrator and is like, you got to do something about this guy. Like there's this sense in the world on Wall Street, in like the legal world, that somehow our narrator is like the closest person Bartleby has to family or something like that, and he's like kind of become like associated with him. So he like goes back, and like he's the one who feels bad and goes and visits him in prison once he finds out that he's there, even though he's like not personally necessarily responsible for him being in prison. He tries to take care of him there, and etc. So there is this sense of like closeness and maybe like responsibility or guilt, right, around this. But I do want to talk a little bit more about the narrator as a character and like what that might mean for his narration, right? So this is early on. I have paragraph numbers if anybody's like following along. So this is paragraph 3. He says, I am a man who from his youth upwards has been filled with a profound conviction that the easiest way of life is the best. Hence, though I belong to a profession proverbially energetic and nervous, that is, law, even to turbulence at times, yet nothing of that sort have I ever suffered to invade my peace. I am one of those unambitious lawyers who never addresses a jury or in any way draws down public applause, but in the cool tranquility of a snug retreat, do a snug business among rich men's bonds and mortgages and title deeds. All who know me consider me an eminently safe man. So, like, let's like hang out. Let's hang out there for a minute, right? Like, this, the easiest way of life is the best. I'm an eminently safe man, right? So this is a person who, like, that's how he describes himself to us, right? Like, he's giving us that, right? And, like, so to me, like, that really influences my sense of his reactions to Bartleby throughout, right? So, like, Luke, you see him as being very kind, but I think there's places where he even describes his kindness as convenient. Like, that's so much of his, like, allowing Bartleby and, like, suffering Bartleby to stay in his office is just, it's easier not to get rid of him. Right.
It's the path of least resistance.
Right. Yeah. And so, like, his, like, niceness is, like, an effect. It's not necessarily an intention, right? Like, it's just sort of how things go because it's easier not, and like, who does that sound like, right? But Bartleby, right? Exactly. Like, our narrator would prefer not to call the cops on his...
Well, I think there are a lot of the superficial interpretations of Bartleby is that he's lazy, but I guess what you're trying to say here is that the narrator is lazy in his own way.
Right. I mean, I don't know if... lazy is, like, that is, like, I guess what being eminently safe, and the easiest way of life is the best is certainly, like, would be associated with, like, a kind of laziness. But our narrator also is, like... he's well off. I mean, he's a lawyer. But then right after this eminently safe thing, right, we get this whole thing about John Jacob Astor. The late John Jacob Astor, a personage little given to poetic enthusiasm, had no hesitation in pronouncing my first grand point to be prudence, my next method. I do not speak it in vanity, but simply record the fact that I was not unemployed in my profession by the late John Jacob Astor. A name which I admit I love to repeat, for it hath a rounded and orbicular sound to it, and rings like unto bullion.
I love those songs.
I will freely add that I was not insensible to the late John Jacob Astor's good opinion. And so we go on to learn that, like, he's been given this office, what Master in Chancery, which is a pretty sweet deal. Like, he makes a lot of money and doesn't have to do a lot of work, right? Like, that's what I get about what the Master of Chancery is, right? It was not a very arduous office, but very pleasantly remunerative. I seldom lose my temper, much more seldom indulge in dangerous indignation at wrongs and outrages, but I must be permitted to be rash here and declare that I consider the sudden violent abrogation of the office of Master of Chancery by the new Constitution as a expletive, premature act, inasmuch as I had counted upon a life lease of the profits, whereas I only received those of a few short years. But this is by the way. So, like, for me, in my copy, like, all in my first page, right, we get this, like, kind of admission of a certain kind of laziness, right? And that being associated with, like, I had come into this, like, well, first of all, I'm the kind of lawyer who, like, doesn't argue in front of a jury because that's, like, too hard and too stressful. And so I just, like, fill out papers and do bonds and, like, whatever. But also that he had come into this, like, sweet office that was paying him a bunch of money, and, like, the one thing he's ever gotten mad about in his life is that was taken away from him, you know, and he feels like that was unjust or something like that, right? And so it's like that's who our guy is that, like, he's, you know, wants to make an easy buck, right? And not do a lot of work for it, right? So that to me, like, colors, I guess, like, the rest of his, like, how I think about his, like, reactions throughout the. But
I mean, I guess what I'm saying, there still is goodness to the man.
Oh yeah,
right?
I mean, I'm not trying to say he's terrible, but, like, the idea that, like, he is like benevolent toward Bartleby seems. I'm not sure that the text fully holds that one up.
Okay. Well, the things that I was drawing upon, like, for instance, like, when he gives him more money than he needed to in order to find a new place to stay, or, like, when he goes and visits him in prison to make sure that he's taken care of, these are things he didn't have to do.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So it seems like they're almost supererogatory in some way.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that they're not things that he had to do, but I think that, and they are things that would kind of cleanse his conscience of something, you know, like that, right?
Okay,
like that there's a certain kind of, like, there's so much to say here, right? Like, because, like, the thing with money is really interesting, right? Because there's so many things throughout the text that show how poor these workers are and how rich this guy is.
Right.
Right? Like, that's something that comes up so much, right? That, like, is it Turkey who, like, spends all of his money on red ink, you know? And, like, Turkey doesn't have a coat in the winter, and the guy is, like, generous to give him his, like, old, probably crappy coat.
Right.
And so, like, that, like, yeah, like, this narrator has that money to throw around.
Right.
Like, you know, whereas these characters, like, you know, so it's like, it isn't, like, $20 to Bartleby would be a lot if he cared about it, it seems like, right? But it's, like, maybe not that much to our narrator, right? So
maybe just, like, tossing him pennies, something like that.
Yeah, because, and, you know, there's, like, speaking of tossing pennies, I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to find it, but there's this one moment where he's talking about how honest Bartleby is, and so he, like, doesn't mind that he's, like, so Bartleby's, like, staying in the chambers the whole time, right? Like, it's quickly discovered that he actually doesn't have a home, he doesn't go home, and he's just, like, in the law office all night. And he's, like, made a little bed blanket for himself in his little corner that he's assigned to, and he has a little wash basin and whatever. And so at some point, the narrator is talking about how he doesn't, at no point is he, like, distrustful of Bartleby because he knows he's, like, an honest man. And one of the things that he cites in it for that is how Bartleby has often returned to him, like, pennies and nickels or whatever that he's dropped on the floor. Oh, yes,
that's true. That's
right. But the narrator is like, and they don't mean anything to me. Like, he's just like, oh, you know, whatever, they're pennies. Like, I don't care about them. But he still needs to return them to me, to be honest. You know. So there's this funny, like,
right.
I don't want them to get any extra money, but, like, I also have so much of it. So, right. So. So that's our narrator who has some sort of, like, guilt or, like, you know, wants to cleanse his conscience of something, maybe, or convince himself that he's not guilty of anything, right?
So if you wouldn't say that he was kind or generous in any way, or that he didn't have some goodness in him, would you feel comfortable judging him in any way?
Well, so, I mean, I think that's a big move, right? Like, I think that, like, I don't want to say that he's like has no kindness or no goodness in him, but like I definitely do not want to leave it as he's really kind to Bartleby.
Sure.
Like that I'm not okay with. Does that make
sense?
You
want to problematize it.
Yes.
Okay.
Because I think that like in some ways this is like a weird reversal. Like it's like I don't think his intentions are necessarily like to be good to Bartleby always. Like I think many times he mentions, right, like that he like there's this change that happens, right, when he's like, I would let Bartleby keep living there and keep doing, I would employ him to do nothing. But all these people are talking about me, and I can't have that, right?
Well,
he has this whole thing,
and he can't have a mutiny in his office because the other copyists for him, Turkey and Nippers or whatnot, like if they start seeing that Bartleby gets disproportionate treatment,
I guess
they're not going to take too kindly to. Isn't one of them pretty irascible? Well, isn't Turkey prone to violence?
Well, so that's another. The Turkey and Nippers are both have big like personalities, and it's like in the mornings Turkey is very productive, and after lunch he kind of goes crazy,
right?
And then in the morning Nippers is like can't really be controlled, but he's calmer in the afternoon. And I know Nippers has indigestion in the morning, and Turkey, I forget what his, or no, maybe it's
there's something about his sleep schedule. Somebody has
anyway. So they're like these opposite people who like in the morning you have like one person working, in the afternoon you have one person working, and then you have them being crazy at the opposite times. And so that's also interesting too, right? Is that like he's already this employer who like keeps these before Bartleby even enters the scene, right? So we don't even meet Bartleby until a few pages in. Like we get this like pretty detailed history of like our narrator and like who works for him, what kind of work he does, right? And we get a few paragraphs on like Turkey and then Nippers and then Ginger Nut. Ginger Nut's a 12-year-old. And so Turkey and Nippers, have these opposite things and they balance each other out, and he says that. But also, so there's a way in which they're a pair, right? In the way that like we will see that Bartleby and the narrator are a pair, right? So there's that little parallelism that's happening. So Turkey and Nippers are both these people who are like pretty ridiculous, and like most employers wouldn't tolerate them. And so even before we meet Bartleby, right, we have the narrator talking about like, oh, like Turkey does this crazy stuff, and I should really turn him out, I should really fire him, but in the morning he's so great. And in the afternoon, like there's that great line, but the blots, Turkey, right? Yeah. Like, I don't know if I can find it, but it's not that important. It's just like a funny thing about ink blots. That. So it's like before you get what I'm saying, yeah. But the blots, Turkey, intimated I. Like he already is taking the path of least resistance because like. To fire Turkey when Turkey is angry would probably get him punched in the face or whatever, and he doesn't want to deal with it. And so that's what he's doing. And then Ginger Nut is like perfectly fine because Ginger Nut gets paid $1 a week, I think, or something like that, to clean and be an errand boy and do errands for the people or whatever, other people in the office. So he has Turkey and Nippers. I don't really remember. I mean, I do remember like points where the narrator asked Turkey and Nippers for like their advice on Bartleby or like for just sort of like backup, and they're like, yeah, like that guy's crazy, or like you shouldn't let him walk all over you, or like I'll punch him or whatever. But I don't get that is a reason why he has to get rid of him. Like I don't think that like I don't remember that being at least explicitly mentioned. But what is explicitly mentioned is this like all the lawyers who come to my office are talking about me, and he's like, and I can't. That's intolerable. I can't have that, right? And so it's like, okay, well, a circle of my professional acquaintance, a whisper of wonder was running around, having reference to the strange creature I kept at my office. This worried me very much. And as the idea came upon me of his possibly turning out a long-lived man and keep occupying my chambers and denying my authority and perplexing my visitors and scandalizing my professional reputation and casting a general gloom over the premises, keeping soul and body together to the last upon his savings, and in the end perhaps outlive me and claim possession of my office by right of his perpetual occupancy.
Right, because the narrator's like around 60 years old. Mm-hmm. Do we know how old Bartleby is?
I think we're supposed to take that he's like probably like a generation younger, but we don't really know, as all these dark anticipations crowded upon me, and more my friends continually intruded their relentless remarks upon the apparition in my room, a great change was wrought in me. I resolved to gather all my faculties together and forever rid me of this intolerable incubus. So like to me, what I take from that is like people are talking about me and it's ruining my reputation, and so I had to get rid of this guy. Right? That's not kindness. Like like that's like, I mean that's like how he's getting rid of him or whatever. But it's like he's just like he's swayed by like outward perceptions, I guess, or what he's projecting, or how he's perceived, and so he doesn't, as much as he like. at points it's easier to just let Bartleby be. But then once he starts to me, it's like he starts to feel like it would be worth overcoming that bit of inertia because of his reputation, you know. So, right. The other thing, I guess, to mention, and this might fit in a bit with, like, the work that they're actually doing, is to me is very important, like, that he's a Scrivener, and, like, we've talked about this already a little bit, but, like, that the narrator, that Bartleby isn't telling his own story seems really important, right? That, like, it's being narrated by his boss, right? Like, by the person who employs him, or did employ him, and, like, the nature of the work that they're doing, like, that... So the narrator's a lawyer. The copyists to me are basically like, they're like Xerox machines, I think, you know, before the time. There's all kinds of reasons why documents need to be copied, and these are just being copied in longhand. And so, you know, reading it now, right, it's like, well, that work is now done by machines. Like, there's people who don't have this job anymore. And so... At the time, obviously, it's like not going to be read that way, but like these are people who are not, like, it refers to them as writing, right? But they're not, like, they're copying, like they're not, they don't have like authorship, or like they're not putting their names on anything, you know, like they're just copying the lawyer's stuff. And so that the lawyer is like the author or whatever of all of the writing that's happening here, and he's the author of but he's the narrator of the story, seems interesting, right? That, like, I don't know, all I can say is like, that's an interesting parallel. I'm not sure that I have like a perfect, wonderful interpretation of it, but it's like, I want to draw our attention to like the ways in which this is very much a story about writing, right? And a story about literature.
Were you at all interested in bringing any of the literary theory that we've been covering lately?
I mean, that's your thing now.
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
Like, I haven't read Foucault in many years, so if you want to talk about that, you can.
I don't. You've alerted me to it. I'll have to think about it a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. So there's this moment when Bartleby's in jail at the end, and I think it's when Mr. Cutlets, who is the you caught his name,
it's the chef, right?
The chef, the food purveyor in jail. He's like a salesman, you know, he's like trying to get like people's friends to like pay for them to have food and stuff. But I think it's him who said, or maybe it might actually be one of the turnkeys. Anyway, it's one of the people who's in the jail who like says that they assumed that Bartleby was a gentleman forger. Yeah, I think this is Cutlets. I thought that friend of yourn was a gentleman forger. They are always pale and genteel like them forgers. I can't help pity 'em. Can't help it, sir. And so this idea that Bartleby is a forger, right, is like, that detail is like, you know, I mean, you know, in a short story, every detail matters. Like, he is a forger. Like, that's what a copyist is, you know? So there's this way in which, like, anything that Bartleby or Turkey or Nippers could write would be a forgery. And, like, so Nippers, right, has this little side hustle that we don't really fully understand. And, like, I think if we followed out all those references and, like, looked up some of the words, I might be able to understand, like, the implications of what's going on with Nippers. But he has these people who come by the office who he calls his clients, I think, right? So he has some kind of thing he's doing where he might be, I don't know, he might be, like, practicing law without a license or, like, doing something with people in jail. Like, we don't really know, right? But he is doing something that's, like, forgery. Like, I think, actually, like, not just copying, you know? So that, to me, there's something there about, like, one of these kinds of things is allowed, like, and one of them is not, and, like, what's the difference? So there's something here about, like, Bartleby not having, like, authorship of his own life. I mean, before we even get to that, I guess, it's, like, he doesn't have, he's lacking a kind of, it would seem that, well, not even Bartleby, a Scrivener would seem to be lacking a kind of agency about their own life. And that, like, because they're at the mercy of this other person who's, like, they have a boss, and the boss is telling them what to do, and they have to be accountable, right?
Totally.
Right, so there's, like, you know, being an employee, whatever. But then that's, like, to me, that's amplified by the work that they're doing, right? It's, like, just reflecting that as, like, they're copying. And they don't have, like, authority, authorship-related words, right? And so then what's so interesting about Bartleby is that, like, all he can do, maybe, to kind of get some of that is do nothing. You know, it's like all he has, the only way that he can be heard or make a mark, have a story written about him, is to do nothing. Is
to assert
is to prefer not to.
He asserts his agency via passive resistance.
Right, exactly. Yeah, what's that line? And so that's like, the brilliance and nothing so aggravates an earnest person as a passive resistance. If the individual so resisted be of a not inhumane temper, and the resisting one perfectly harmless in his passivity, then in the better moods of the former he will endeavor charitably to construe to his imagination what proves impossible to be solved by his judgment. Well, that's a lot of complicated language, but
it's important. It's one of the most important passages in the whole story, or at least it seemed like to me. It struck me.
We can unpack it if you want. Yeah, so nothing so aggravates an earnest person as a passive resistance. So, I think we get that. But if the individual so resisted, so that would be our narrator, I think, be of a not inhumane temper. So this reading, which is probably like my fifth reading of the story, I really notice our narrators love the double negative. And I don't know what to make of it, but there's a ton, and it's like he's very into
There's
that.
lots of really interesting word choices throughout this. Like, I love the fact that he doesn't say predestined, he says predestinated.
Oh, yeah.
When he talks about Bartleby's entrance into his life. And I believe there's one other occasion where he
adds an extra ending or something like that. Yeah. So he's, so this is, and in some ways that gets at, like, why is our narrator telling us the story or whatever, is that, like, he has a pleasure with language. Like, he has a pleasure with words that, in a sort of self-satisfaction, because it's, like, a lot of the, like, there's many asides to, like, explaining his own motives and, like, that kind of thing, which we can take as being defensive and all that, as we were talking about. But it's also, like, there's something strange. There's, like, a pride or a, like, narcissism or something that's, like, tied up in that, too. It's an individual so resisted be of a not inhumane temper, i.e. a humane temper, and the resisting one perfectly harmless in his passivity, Bartleby, perfectly harmless, then in the better moods of the former, the good moods of our narrator, he will endeavor charitably to construe to his imagination what proves impossible to be solved by his judgment. And so in some ways, I guess that is a really good thing to point to, right? Because he... like, logic has that's not working, right? Like, he cannot explain Bartleby's behavior. Bartleby will not explain it. And so, like, he's like, well, maybe it's this thing, maybe it's that thing, right? Like, it's like he's trying to tell a story, I guess, about it, or he's, trying to imagine.
Bartleby almost seems like, kind of like, I don't want to, we haven't talked very much about Bartleby, and I want to, and you talk about him being paired with the narrator, or extension maybe, even, or something like that. But he seems to be kind of almost like this irrational man that cannot be negotiated with, not unlike, say, like, we don't negotiate with terrorists or something like that, because they're not rational to begin with. So I guess, what is that telling of? Is this, like, a part of the narrator, an irrational part of himself?
Yeah, that's definitely one reading, is that, like, I, like, paired with that, and, like, why we haven't talked about Bartleby that much is that, like, I'm not sure this is Bartleby's story. Like, this is the narrator's story. This is about the narrator.
Yeah.
Like, it's not really about Bartleby. And so we can talk about Bartleby. Like, I like to go into it this way by talking about the narrator, and I like to let this happen, and then I like to do this. Because I think this narrator does have this pleasure with language. He seems very self-satisfied. It's all about justifying all the stuff about his own reactions to Bartleby, rather than it is about telling Bartleby's story.
Right.
It's about telling his own story as Bartleby, like, entered his life,
Yes.
And affected him. And I do, but at the same time, right, it's like the sort of brilliance of Bartleby, right, is that he has found something that seems like resistance, maybe, that's through inaction, and that it's like he's, I want to say that, like, is he, like, grinding the wheels of capitalism to a halt, and he's not doing that, but, he is, like, he's managing to live, sort of, without having to work, but it's a miserable existence, and it's, like, leading to his own death. Like, is he committing a kind of slow suicide? I don't know. But yeah, so as far as the pairing with the author, with the narrator, that's definitely, like, one reading of it, right, is that he is this, like, they're two parts of the whole, and that the narrator is constantly going through these explanations and these, like, rationalizations, and, like, like, he's, like, he does these abstractions too. He's like this same kind of thing, right? Nothing so aggravates an earnest person. Like, let me make this pronouncement about humanity, when really I'm, like, talking about myself. And so maybe Bartleby represents, like you're saying, this, like, other irrational sort of part of him.
Well, does Bartleby just represent it? And like, does he project this thing that's in him onto Bartleby? Or is like Bartleby like a figment of his imagination, like a la like Tyler Durden in sort of Fight Club or something that, like where there's a split personality.
Yeah.
Because you've got the other individual seeming to testify that he does in fact exist.
Right, but our narrator is the narrator, so everything's through the narrator.
His story, yeah.
So like, right, so yeah, you're right. Yes, Turkey. Like we definitely have interactions between Bartleby and other people. He's witnessed by everybody else in the story.
But they all exist in his imagination.
But the narrator, everything is through the narrator. So like, yeah, like it could be that. Turkey and nippers could also be like, who knows what their deal is, right? Like this is a story told to us by this person who, like, to me is like, the more I think about it, the less reliable he seems, So, and like, which is another way of saying the more that this is a story about the narrator than it is a story about Bartleby. So yeah, it's not like one of these things where you like discover, wait, hold on, like only the narrator is the person who's only ever seen Bartleby. It's like, we can't really figure that out, right? Yeah, what else did I want to talk about? We talked about money and working conditions. We talked about the kind of work that they're doing. I'll go on a little like detour into some literary history here. So when I've taught this story in the past, it's been usually in a kind of lecture series. What do you call it? On like kind of literary history, American literary history kind of thing. And
would this fall within like romanticism? Because it also seems to have like some absurdist elements to it too, right? Like it strikes me to be an existential prose piece in the sense that like Bartleby cannot be reasoned with. It doesn't sound not unlike something that, I don't know, Beckett or someone else would do.
Yeah.
Is that wrong to say that?
Well, no, I mean, it's 100 years earlier than Beckett.
Of course, but it seems
of course, like,
to anticipate that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, in some ways, like, that fits with my sense of, like, this is a story that just, like, there's so many different possible interpretations, and so in that way it's like a great exercise. It's a great one to teach students how to do literature, like with this story, I think, right?
I'm learning a lot.
Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is like the other is a novel that another work I would go to for that kind of thing, because it's like it holds up to so many different readings of what is going on with Victor Frankenstein and the creature, not the monster, the creature, and it's like, yeah, they can all kind of like, there's all kinds of different interpretations that could all just sort of like layer on top of each other or all work together, and it's fine. And I feel that the story is similar. I think that there's like kind of this sense that like Melville might have been kind of like giving the finger to like the literary world because he didn't have much money at the time. He wasn't very popular, and so I think he was like, what if I give you this like really weird cryptic thing? And that's that.
If I can insert just the little bit of biographical information that I told you off camera, something that we were talking about before we got this going is that Lindsay made reference to Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville being contemporaries, and I actually postulated that the relationship was much closer because there was I believe correspondences between the two, and I think Melville found himself, because he was successful with some of his early works that he didn't find to be particularly fascinating on a philosophical level, but he didn't want to keep copying what his earlier style, even though the public was sort of clamoring for it. That, like you said, this was his way to resist that. I don't know if you would call this passive resistance or something like that, but Bartleby sort of becomes this personification of Melville's, I don't want to do what you know me for anymore. I want to chart a new course. I want to do these philosophical stories and novels like Moby Dick and stuff like that. Sidebar, Moby Dick is like one of my favorite books. So, yeah. Even though I can't fully explain why.
That's right. I've never read Moby Dick, so that's you don't have to be, you don't have to have read all the things to talk about some of them. So to the point on romanticism, on paragraph 19, there's this weird little reference to Byron, just by way of comparison, right? But like, he could have picked a lot of poets and he picked Byron, right? So I can readily imagine that to some sanguine temperaments it would be altogether intolerable. For example, I cannot credit that the meddlesome... this is about the work of the Scrivener, is what this paragraph is about. It is, of course, an indispensable part of a Scrivener's business to verify the accuracy of his copy word by word. Where there are two or more Scriveners in any office, they assist each other in this examination, one reading from the copy, the other holding of the original. It is a very dull, wearisome, and lethargic affair. I can readily imagine that to some sanguine temperaments it would be altogether intolerable. For example, I cannot credit that the meddlesome poem Byron would have contentedly sat down with Bartleby to examine a law document of, say, 500 pages, closely written in a crimpy hand.
Yeah.
Right? So, like, there is this sort of, like, and Byron is writing, a few decades before this, I think, right? Or maybe even contemporary to it. So this idea that, like, the romantic mind, right? The, like, person who's prone to, like, these flights of fancy and all that, like, this is not for them. This is not creative work. And so, like, this thing about, to me, like, thinking about authorship, right? And thinking about, like, do you have any creative license or, that's something that he's even, like, kind of crediting here, that he's like, this is for dull people, or, like, the people who don't have any original works of their own, like, this is the work for them. But what I was going to say about a little bit of literary history was about Hawthorne, and I usually teach this after some Hawthorne stories, and Hawthorne is, like, the, like, great-great-great-grandchild of Puritans or something like that, I forget exactly, but he's very interested he's writing stories that are set, like, generations earlier, right, in, like, Puritan New England. And they're very New England, and they're very overtly religious, or about religion, or engaging religion, and have, like, ministers in them, and all that kind of stuff. And, so this is the Scarlet Letter, this is the Minister's Black Veil, Young Goodman Brown. So for one, like, they're set in New England, and they're set in these, like, very small villages, and, like, nature plays a big part, right? And so this is this huge shift that we have in literary history, where, like, now we are in the city, and we're in this building where, like, you look out the window and it's a brick wall, because it's been built, everything's been built up so much that what used to be, like, a useful window is now just, like, another wall. So that's this interesting shift that's happening in, like, the environs or whatever of American literature. And it's interesting, actually, in reference to Romanticism, right? Because, like, Romanticism in Europe is very much like, there's a lot of going out into nature and experiencing the sublime and all that kind of stuff, right? And so the sublime in the US is a little bit different for various reasons, but there is, like, I think of American Romanticism as does that need to be back on? As a kind of New England thing, right? Like, even, like, transcendentalism, right? The sort of Walden Pond is, like, coming out of that. So we've moved settings, but also, like, something that's interesting to think about with Hawthorne, and the Puritan ancestors, Puritan legacy or whatever, is the way that, my understanding of, the Calvinist church or the Puritan church was that you had to, like, convince you had to give an account of how you knew you were saved. So, like, men and women, like, you weren't just automatically, like, elect. You had to, like, get up in church and tell your story of how you knew that you were the elect. And so if you think about that, that's, like, incredible. That, like, women in particular, like, white, privileged, etc. women, but still women, were standing up in church and telling their stories, right? Like, I think that, like, subsequently kind of went away. But this idea of, like, having this, like, deep self-reflection, like, journal writing, anything like that is, like, that's a Puritan, that's a legacy of Puritanism, right? And so, personal narrative, telling one's own story, right, is this thing that is a foundational, I think, to American literature, right? Like, again, this influences, like, transcendentalism and stuff like that. But here we have a story about people, like, who cannot tell their own stories, so there's something interesting about that shift. And again, I don't have, like, a definitive thing about it. It seems to coincide with this move into the city. It seems to coincide with some sort of, like, growth of capitalism in Wall Street that's, like, surrounding this whole thing, right? But just, I don't know, some open-ended sort of context.
Well, it seems like you could make possibly some sort of Marxist critique or something like that. That they lose themselves in the labor that they're engaged in.
Oh, absolutely! This is totally alienated. Yeah. Like, this is alienated labor, right? Like, this is it, right? That they are just copying. So,
I see.
Yeah. So something else, like, I guess I want to. I don't know how helpful this is, but I sometimes my students like to explore the particular ways in which Bartleby resists, I guess, or what he prefers not to do. Because it's, like, I didn't catch this the first time I read the story, it took a few readings, but, like, the first thing that he prefers not to do is not to copy, but to do this thing I was just reading about, this, like, verifying the accuracy of the copy. And so that's interesting, because it's like he's been copying for 3 days, and it's on the third day that the narrator asks him to, and this fits with your Jesus reading, right, that on the third day this thing changes.
Well, I don't know if I have a very articulated Jesus reading or something
just,
like that.
You probably got a Jesus reading, so...
I just assume everything. That's my starting point.
Right, exactly. Yeah. That's good. You're learning to do literature. So he... what was I saying? Yeah, so he prefers not to do the, like, verifying the copy thing. And that's really interesting, because it's like, well, why would that be the thing he prefers not to do? Like, I don't... Because eventually he prefers to do nothing, right? But it takes... Then after that, he still copies for a while. Like, he's still useful. He just won't do the reading thing. But he always resists that. And so... Like,
we're given a little bit of an explanation, right? It has something to do with this, maybe diminished eyesight or something like that. He never really affirms it.
Yeah, we get that in one... I take that to be, like, in one acute moment. Like, that is, like, what's going on, right? Because, I mean, to copy, you're still... Right? Because I think at that point it might actually be why he won't copy at all, or won't do any work at all. I don't remember. But there's... I mean... I don't know if this like holds up to anything, right? But there's something about Bartleby's very solitary, right? Like, he doesn't interact with like Turkey and Nippers, who are like, not good buds, but they seem to like interact with each other, and like they went to lunch together one day. That gets mentioned that they like both,
they'll have a beer
whatever.
Here and there,
right? They'll have a beer together. And then Ginger Nut is like the errand boy, and so like he, interacts with everybody. But like there's a part of me was like, oh, is it that Bartleby doesn't want any kind of social interaction? That it's like the interactive aspect of the reading, the verification was like something he doesn't want. Like, he doesn't want any kind of human contact. That it's a resistance to this sort of basic part of human life, right? But then, it was actually one of my students years ago who pointed out to me, like, what if he doesn't know how to read? Which is interesting, because you could be a copyist, right, without like knowing how to read.
Sure.
But that, like, to verify accuracy would involve actually like understanding, or like like hearing the things. So that's sort of interesting, and I don't know if those things sort of hold up to anything, but like the idea that you could actually do the work of a copyist without actually even knowing how to read does seem to fit with some of the stuff we're saying about authorship and being able to tell one's own story. What else do we want to cover? I mean, what do you...
there was one thing that fascinated me.
Can I go absolutely, you should.
Okay.
I think I feel like I'm hogging it.
All right, so one of the things I thought was particularly interesting is that there is this addendum, there's this appendix or whatever, that gives us a little bit of the backstory of Bartleby, right? And it's revealed there that before he came to work for the lawyer, is that he worked in a dead letter office.
It's rumored.
It's rumored that he was working in a dead letter office. And I didn't know what that was, and so I had to look that up. And apparently what a dead letter office is like letters that ultimately have no destination, right? Like, so these are like letters written to God, letters written to Santa Claus, to people who are deceased, blah, 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 blah. And I wonder if that says something... I wonder if Melville is trying to say something about our own being in that respect. Yeah. Like, that we are all these sort of authors, these writings or whatever, that ultimately end up going nowhere. I didn't know if that was something that he was trying to shoehorn into that. I thought...
Well, I mean, he put that thing at the very end, so, like, that is a place of emphasis for sure, that he was just like, addendum, dead letter office, like, is definitely, like, so there's a lot to it. Yeah.
Do you want to say anything about it, or... I just thought that I thought it was intriguing.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's it's after that, right, that we get Bartleby, the humanity. I didn't
know that was somebody's job. Like, when a child puts a letter to God in the mail, I just feel like it ends up in like a BuzzFeed article or something like that.
Yeah, it might now. Who knows?
Gives you goosebumps.
It probably just gets it probably gets like scanned and OCR'd and something. But I mean. Maybe, I mean, we could stay close to the text, maybe, and just, maybe we can try to figure out...
Do you want to read it?
Sure.
It's not that long.
Yeah, the whole thing? Or,
yeah, sure, or the relevant half paragraph.
Okay, so yeah, he has this whole thing about, like, oh, I've heard this rumor, I don't know if I should mention it, but I need to mention it. The report was this, that Bartleby had been a subordinate clerk in the dead letter office at Washington, from which he had been suddenly removed by a change in the administration. When I think over this rumor, I cannot adequately express the emotions which seize me. Dead letters. Does it not sound like dead men? Conceive a man by nature and misfortune prone to a pallid hopelessness. Can any business seem more fitted to heighten it than that of continually handling these dead letters and assorting them for the flames? For by the cartload they are annually burned. Sometimes, from out the loaded paper, the pale clerk takes a ring. The finger it was meant for, perhaps moulders in the grave. A banknote sent in swiftest charity. He whom it would relieve, nor eats nor hungers any more. Pardon for those who died despairing. Hope for those who died unhoping. Good tidings for those who died stifled by unrelieved calamities. On errands of life, these letters speed to death. Ah, Bartleby. Ah, the humanity.
That's beautiful. I love that. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if this lawyer sees him as someone who's sort of sending out men in a similar sort of fashion, right? Where they ultimately ended up going down to dead ends, right? Because they have no originality or generate anything new in and of themselves.
Oh, so you mean that like he feels that that he's expressing some kind of guilt about his job, or about
possibly. I don't know. Yeah.
Huh,
I mean, that was one potential way to read it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think...
Or maybe he understands that's what everybody's fate is. Because there is that talk about, again, predestinated ends, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I take... In some ways, it's like, yeah, he's going on one of these, like, florid, not tangents, but, like, he's at florid intensity. But I guess the thing that I kind of attach to... And it's interesting to teach. I've taught this over the years, right? And like, I feel like as our culture becomes like more comfortable with like talking about mental health, my students really attach to like, oh, Bartleby's depressed, and they're like he's clinically depressed. That's what's going on with Bartleby. Like I had a student who like that was like his interpretation of this whole story last year. And
pretty convenient explanation.
Yeah, right? And I was like, okay, well, like I still need you to do more than that. Like I still like need that. We're not done, And like to him, it was like this is this like explanation of this is like a story about clinical depression before it had a name, and Melville knew it, and like that's it, But anyway, so what I attach to here is this sense of like him being, a man by nature and misfortune prone to a pallid hopelessness. That he is like, there's something before the dead letter office. There's something about Bartleby that like makes him, that would make working at the dead letter office like particularly rough for him or something like that. Like it would affect him more deeply. And that is mentioned a few times, right? That like, what was it? There's like this, one of my favorite sections is this thing about like,
or maybe there was something about working at the dead letter office that made him so inept at the copying. Maybe there was something some insight that he gained in working at the dead letter office that he's just like, no, I don't do these things.
Right. But then what? So I mean, this is where like where does Bartleby come from? Like this sort of returns to like, is he a real person or is he a figment? Because he just like emerges in the office and like doesn't want to do the work, And so, not in the dead letter office. I mean the like actual like law office. Yeah. Like like to show up and then very quickly like decide you're not doing your job. Like it's like we're not in this like realistic kind of space. I'm going to point to one of my favorite sections, which is paragraph 89.
If it's the same one that I wanted to point to, too.
For both I and Bartleby were sons of Adam. I remembered the bright silks and sparkling faces I had seen that day in gala trim, swan-like sailing down the Mississippi of Broadway, and I contrasted them with the pallid copyist, and thought to myself, happiness courts the light, so we deem the world is gay, but misery hides aloof, so we deem that misery there is none. These sad fancyings, chimeras, doubtless, of a sick and silly brain, led on to other and more special thoughts concerning the eccentricities of Bartleby. Presentiments of strange discoveries hovered round me. The Scrivener's pale form appeared to me laid out among uncaring strangers in its shivering, winding sheet. But yeah, just the happiness courts the light, and so we deem the world is gay.
I love how you mentioned the sons of Adam, because there's another biblical reference in here. There are all these sorts of
There's a few. Reference, yeah. I mean, if you it depends on what you consider, but yeah.
Well, there's one towards the end there where he checks on Bartleby to see if he's alive.
Yep.
Do you know
curled up. I don't know the reference you're talking about, but I know the scene.
It's a passage from Job. He says
I didn't get that.
He says something to the effects of he sleeps with
that he with kings and counselors.
With kings and counselors. That's a reference to Job.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I guess I figured it was a reference to something. So, yeah, and there's also, I mean, if you want to do these kinds of readings, like. That on the third day was like when he starts resisting. That what is it? Oh, there's something about like the four because like the lawyer needs Bartleby so they could, and the 3 other clerks, so that they can do. There's something that was written in quadruplicate, and I think I read somewhere that's like the 4 Gospels or something like that. Because like they have similar. There's a source material, right? Or like there's or not. Well, no, I guess John doesn't have the same source material, but like they're telling the same story, right? There's like but
different aspects,
something they have in common, right? But then there's these like 4 guys, which like obviously it's not. They're supposed to be identical, but yeah. So how do we think, so Bartleby dies in prison, presumably of starvation. He hasn't been eating very much at all, like during the whole course of the story. He's like existing on ginger nut cookies and like
cheese,
maybe
and
some
crumbs,
cheese.
yeah.
We don't really know. And I guess he's always been pallid, but I guess he's sort of wasting away. And then he's only in jail for a couple days. And our lawyer arranges for him to have food, but he doesn't eat any of it. And so we don't really get exactly how he dies. If that, like, you called it a hunger strike earlier, and I guess it kind of is, but a hunger strike is like such a political act that like Bartleby doesn't seem, like that's not the kind of thing he does. Like he prefers not to do anything. So like in a way, like a hunger strike is like a radical statement. Though I guess it fits with like not doing things. That it is an inaction that is a powerful action. So it is. Like,
it seems like an indictment against all existence in a way. Not necessarily a political system, but just being like, I don't want to be a part of this world at all anymore.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
On his part. But I mean, like hunger strikes as they've been happening in prisons in the last few years are like not that. Right. They are particular to like I think particular causes.
Bartleby seems to grasp some essential truth, and therefore has like this sort of renunciation of the world, even sustenance and food.
Yes. So like that. Right. So he like prefers not to eat. Eventually,
right.
So like that seems to be like it's like he's preferring not to do more and more things, right? As at first it's not even copying, but like verifying, then it's copying, then it's leaving the office, eating, it's all these things, and then like the lawyer gives him all these options of like, oh, do you want if I give you money to go here? What if you took this other job? And he's like, I don't want any of it.
Yeah.
But so what do you make of like what is Bartleby? I mean, it seems like we're getting at something here that like Bartleby has some sort of understanding or a different view, at least, of like the world or of life,
totally,
than anybody else. That like, he might have some sort of insight into something that like nobody else sees. It's like the veil has been lifted for him for some reason, whereas everybody else is still just like trucking along. Is he like? I don't know, like, does he make a statement? Is he successful? Is he, like, successful makes it sound like he has a particular aim, and I'm not sure that he does, but,
Well, it depends on how you define the success, right? Like, he's not trying to get the newspapers to pay attention to him or anything like that, so he's not trying to mobilize some sort of, like, world historical effort to, usher us into some new enlightened era or something like that. But is he successful in conquering all that which is temporal? You might be able to make the case that he is, right? Like he's able to totally live without,
right?
And it seems very
that he has achieved a kind of transcendence.
It seems like he achieves a sort of enlightened perspective. That he seems to be an interesting sort of ascetic, right? Where words sort of fail to capture this this new level of consciousness that he has attained,
right?
But it's all kind of speculation. I mean, that was my first read.
I'm with you, and I just think it's interesting then to like think about our narrator again, right? That like that. So if Bartleby achieves that, right? That like that we're given that through this narrator who would seem to be, like he presents himself as perplexed by Bartleby the whole time and like trying to figure him out, but like he never is like. I mean, what he offers at the end is this thing about the dead letter office. But even that is like a, like in some ways that is a like that doesn't. It gives like a cause kind of, right? It gives like a little bit of backstory to how Bartleby is, but it doesn't give it doesn't like summarize what Bartleby's after, right? Or like what is really going on, like in it, or maybe it even is like a dodge, right? By like saying it's like, oh, he's depressed, or he's had this really sad experience, so it's hard to go out in the world when you've seen. All this, like, the dead letter stuff. Where was I going with this?
Well, that ultimately the narrator seems to be perplexed by Bartleby. Like, right, he has this very complicated relationship, and then one hand, he can't understand him, but he thinks there might be, he has so much respect for him, too, that maybe there's something to be learned from him.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's what I wanted to point to is that, like, if Bartleby is, like, able to achieve a kind of asceticism, transcendence, like, veil lifting, whatever. Like, and this is, like, you know, from all worldly passions, I guess we could say, right? And, like, I'm kind of interested in the Marxist reading, too, that it's, like, the veil of capitalism has sort of been lifted for him, and he, like, understands that it's all BS, and that work is, like, you know, everybody's alienated from their labor and there's no pleasure in it, and, like, we don't have the access to the fruits of our labor and all that stuff. And so, but our narrator is, like, Captain Capitalist, you know? Like, he is a lawyer, he is, like, benefiting from a system that, like, has, like, let him be fairly privileged, and, you know, and he doesn't have to work that hard, but, like, he somehow has a lot of money, right? And so, like, the idea that Bartleby is, like, has seen through that seems interesting as, like, that fits to me with, like, the narrator trying to, like, exorcise some kind of guilt, or, like, justify his own actions, right? Because it's, like, he's not just justifying his own, or working through his reactions and actions with regard to Bartleby, right? But with regard to, like, his whole life, I think, you know, that to, like, his employment of these people, and, like, him being this person who's just, like, benefited from, like, getting this office, and and, like, you know, not being a person who works hard, and all that kind of stuff. So whether that, you know, I don't know that answers the question of, like, is Bartleby a figment? And he's mentioned as a ghost many times, right?
He is.
Like, that's, like, I think he's an apparition. I forget. You know, he haunts, that kind of thing. So, you know, I don't know if it answers, like, how, like, real Bartleby is in the story, but it does, I think we're kind of getting to something about the relationship with the narrator, at least. Yeah, what else do we want to say? I mean, the dead letter office stuff is good. I never know how to end.
Well, no, I think
Noetic.
I mean, look, we're running up against an hour, so it's a good marking point. I mean, look, I think it's fascinating. I want to think about it a lot more, and I think what we've done is that we've opened the floodgates for people to build on this initial sort of criticism that you've proffered. So. Yeah. I have a lot of thinking to do. It was really good. Cool. You're really good at this.
Thanks. So you're a good little sponge. Wants to learn about books. So.
All right, guys. Yes. Anything else? You good?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. Thank you so much for listening. Download the Noetic app, and hopefully Lindsay will join us again in the future. All right. Take care, guys. Bye.
Bye, girls.